Okay, welcome everybody. If you could take your seats and let's begin. O tihei mauri ora, i ngā mana, i ngā reo, i ngā kārangaranga o te moti tēnā koutou. Te mihi tuatahi ki ngā tangata whenua o tēnei wāhi, Ngambri, Ngunnawal, me o rātou whenua, o rātou taonga, o rātou kāinga, o rātou rangatira hoki. Good morning everybody and welcome to the 2024 ANU Migration Update. My name is Alan Gamlin. I'm a professor here at the ANU and the director of the ANU Migration Hub, and it's my pleasure to welcome you. In this part of the world, we begin proceedings with a welcome from the first people of this country, and so it's my honour to call on Paul Giroa-House from the Ngambri and Ngunnawal people to welcome us to country. Paul.
Mandangu, Wurrugawurri, thank you Alan, and Jumburuburu Marambang Marinya. Good morning everyone. Yuandu Paul Giroa-House. My name is Paul Giroa-House. Nadu Maradu Mare Biringo, Gujigango, Ngambri, Cambri, Nuru Nurumbango. I was born here at the centre of my ancestral country at the Old Canberra Hospital. God bless it. Anyone born in the Old Canberra Hospital? Great to see 1, 2, 3 hospital alumni here this morning. Wura Nyiyang, Wura Mayin, no language, no people. Wallawin Mayin, Wallawin Nurumbango. Healthy people, healthy country. Nadu, Baladu, Ngambri, Cambri, Wogalu, Wallabaloa, Wiradjuri, Gibia, Nyiyang. I'm a Ngambri, Cambri, Wogalu, Wallabaloa, Ngunnawal, Wiradjuri man. I speak Ngambri, Cambri, Wogalu, Wiradjuri language. Yilangalangbu, Gibabango, Wogabu, Migaybu, Diranilbang Mayin. Ladies and gentlemen, young men, young women, distinguished guests, Nyari and Jamali, Ngambri, Cambri, Wogalu, Wallabaloa, Ngunnawal, Ngarigo, Wiradjuri, Mujigang, Yanam Mujayandu. My respects to Ngambri, Cambri, Wogalu, Wallabaloa, Ngunnawal, Ngarigo, Wiradjuri, elders past and present. Nyari and Jamarabu, Mujigango, Nurumbanjiguwa, Ninya Yeridu. My respects to all people and First Nation people from all parts of the world and country. Ngambri, Cambri, Wogalu, Wallabaloa, Mayin, Gaimbanya, Ninyoga, Nurumbangoldara. Ngambri, Cambri, Wogalu, Wallabaloa people, welcome you all to country. Nadu Wurugibigi, Balabambo Gubu, Balagi Bangubu, Guingulila, Dumbali Now Murraway Marambo. We listen to the old people, the ancestors, the elders, and they show us the good path, the right path, the straight path. Maramara Murru, Murru Waru, Dulagang Murru, Maramara Murru, creating pathways. Murru Waru, on track, Dulagang Murru, good path. Guingulila, Bilingali now, Yamamali now, Wallamali now. Our old people, they nurture us, they guide us, they protect us. Mambawara, Naminyagu, Wurragabinya, Wurradarego, Winningala, Gubaligo, looking to see, listening to hear, and learning to understand. Niani, Injamali, Nurabangila, Balanin, Wallawin, Galanga, Bangbo, Yaning Gingo, Niani, Mawang, Yao, Biligigila, Yamam Bilgiri, Yani, Marambu, Bagariyan, Yaning Gingo. We look after country so it is healthy for all our people, our children, and we teach and we learn what is right for all on country. Murun Waginya Yinjamara, Muramuru, Wirambira, Nurumbango. Living a respectful way of life cares for country. Yinjamara, Wirambira, Marando Gobo, Giragobo, Yando Gobo. Respect is taking responsibility for the now, the past, the present, and the future. Yinjamara, Boyani, Ang Nurumbango, Bagarigan, Wallamara, Maldain, Mumbai Yuganbrak, Yibai Mulian, Dr. Matilda Williams-House. My respects to our creator, Bayami, our creator and protector, Bayami, our key totems, the crow and the eagle, and my mother, my matriarch, Dr. Matilda Williams-House. Because of her I can, and because of her we can on our country. My mother was the first Indigenous Australian to be awarded an honorary doctorate here from the ANU in 2017. And my mother was the 2022 Senior National NAIDOC Female Elder of the Year. She provided the first ever welcome to country the day before the national apology for the opening of 42nd Parliament, opening of Parliament of Australia in the 43rd and 44th. And she's a matriarch. She's just a powerhouse for our people on country. So it's about the acknowledgement, respect and honouring of all people. Murubanga bala, winganagu, yambawan, bango nada nada. First to know the nature of things. Our welcome to countries always made in the spirit of peace, harmony and reconciliation for all people of modern Australia. And our main aim always is to establish an atmosphere of mutual respect. through the acknowledgement of our ancestors and the recognition of our rights to declare our special place in the pre- and post-history of the Canberra region. The name Canberra is derived from the name of our people and country right here, the Ngambri, Cambry, Canberra, gazetted on the 22nd of January 1834 under the British colonial government after our people and country. Maragaladal, Walan Mayan Mayangalang, we hold fast to each other, empower the people. Walang Gunmala, Mara Mara Guray, be brave, make change. Diriyawana, Murawara, Nawan Bera, get up, stand up and show up. It's wonderful wall here. Mara Mara, Nyi Giramar Maranya. Respect shapes us and lifts up the people. Mara Mara, Winanga Gigalana Mayan, respect creates people who care for each other. So Guayambana, Nina Nurambango, welcome to country. Thank you. Language we say bangun nara nara yanana walk migration gurani gurani ayin marabala punya ni ngurumba ngu bagari
Thank you so much for welcoming us to country, Paul, and I understand you now have an event with the Vice-Chancellor. Thank you for being with us. I now call on Professor Rebecca Brown, the Provost and Senior Vice President of the ANU, to say a few words of welcome on behalf of ANU and to introduce our keynote speaker.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you, Paul, as he's leaving, for welcoming us to country. Let me also begin by acknowledging that we are meeting on the lands of the Ngambri and the Ngunnawal people. This unceded land was always sacred, and I recognise the enduring connection of First Nations people to these lands. On behalf of the Australian National University, I'm pleased to welcome you to the 2024 ANU Migration Update, organised by the Migration Hub at ANU in collaboration with the International Organisation of Migration and the Department of Home Affairs. We deeply appreciate their support. Migration has always been a catalyst for human progress and conflict. With 281 million migrants worldwide, migration is a defining issue of our time. People move across borders for various reasons, some by choice, others due to circumstances beyond their control. Today, more people live outside of their birth country than ever before, with over half of Australia's population being first or second generation migrants. Regulating migration is a complex task requiring collaboration across sectors and not least disciplines. ANU Migration Hub is a leader in this work, bringing together experts from academia, policy, NGOs and industry to share knowledge, question assumptions and inform solutions to the challenges of population movement. ANU Migration Hub is the first of its kind in this region, serving as a focal point for critical migration research and dialogue, with over 100 members across 5 colleges and more than 20 schools at ANU. The Hub fosters interdisciplinary collaboration. So for more information, you can visit their website at migration.anu.edu.au. Today's event exemplifies the Hub's work, featuring world-leading experts from Australia, the Pacific, the USA and Europe. We're honoured to have Assistant Minister Matt Thistlethwaite continuing the tradition of ministerial addresses at this event. Thank you to all participants, especially our international visitors, for joining us here and sharing your insights. This year's theme, Countering Myths and Delivering Facts, is timely. With half the world's population voting in 2024, many elections will focus on migration issues, often clouded by disinformation. One goal of this event is to counter these myths and provide facts to improve the standard of migration debates in this critical year of democracy. To open the event, I'm honoured to introduce Dr. Mari McAuliffe, who has travelled here from Geneva to be with us today. Dr. McAuliffe is the head of the Migration Research and Publications Division at International Organisation for Migration, an editor of the World Migration Report with over 25 years' experience in the field of migration research and policy. She regularly advises presidents, ministers and CEOs on global migration dynamics and has published extensively in this field. We are proud also to count her as a distinguished alumna of ANU. She completed a PhD in demography here as a Sir Roland Wilson Scholar, and her thesis won the Charles Price Prize for Outstanding Doctoral Research in 2018. She is currently a visiting fellow in the School of Demography, where she received her PhD, and she's a member of our ANU Migration Hub. Dr. McAuliffe, thank you for being here to deliver the opening keynote address for the 2024 ANU Migration Update, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much indeed for that warm welcome. It's nice to be at ANU, it's nice to be home. And this is the first time that I haven't been on a video screen somewhere, with thanks to Alan and the team, of course. Let me begin first today by acknowledging the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, who are the traditional custodians of the Canberra area, and pay respect to the elders past and present of all Australian Indigenous peoples. And it was wonderful, Paul's welcome to country this morning. I really enjoyed that. It really does feel like being home. So I'm really delighted to be able to take you through the World Migration Report launched by the Director General earlier this year in May, and to really just give you a bit of a key highlights and snapshots. Before we start, and I can see it's just been brought up onto the screen, special thanks, of course, to the Migration Hub, to all colleagues at ANU, and I can see many friends and colleagues in the audience now, and also to our fabulous team, IOM Canberra, again collaborating with ANU to bring this event together, as well as our colleagues at the Department of Home Affairs. Again, another former home, so really delighted to be here today. Special thanks to Alan, of course, for bringing us all together. And this is my third, I think it is, Migration Hub network update, the ANU Migration Update, but it's the first time I have actually been here in person. So please forgive my jet lag, is what I would say, as we go through. So what we'll do for the next sort of 15, 20 minutes or so is to really take you through the World Migration Report, the current edition, the 2024 edition, as well as some of the key highlights in terms of how the report is put together, including with our very valued donors, including the Australian Government. If I can just get the mouse to work, that would be great. Okay, here we are. A big hello from our Director General, Amy Pope, as well as our Deputy Director General, Ugochi Daniels, who were here earlier in the year. I was very proud to be an IOMer, but also very proud to be an Australian. They had a wonderful trip and a very memorable trip, and we saw that, I think, in action last week at the Pacific Island Forum as well. As I've highlighted here, just a couple of key points to link really into the theme of this year's migration updates. The World Migration Report, as outlined by the Director General in the foreword, is really about dispelling myths. It's providing key facts and analysis, particularly at the global level, and it's about providing new knowledge as well. And we take some deep dives into some complex and emerging migration issues. It's also designed to be used for a very large and growing audience with different types of outputs, which we can talk about a bit later, so that it inspires new ideas, new areas of intervention, and also new areas of collaboration. This is maybe a lecture in how not to do PowerPoint. This one is always very busy, but if you just have the chance to look at one slide, this is probably it in terms of the World Migration Report series. It is a biennial report published every 2 years as our flagship migration report covering the entire world. We are really very pleased and proud and thankful and grateful to our donors. We have a very small core budget for the World Migration Report, and you can see some of our donors there, including, of course, the Australian government, the US, and we've also extended our partnerships with some private sector companies there. The report, and there's all the covers along the top there, was previously a thematic report. So we would do it every 2 years and say, look at the topic of migrants and cities, or look at migrants and well-being. In 2016, when I started with IOM in Geneva, we did a full evaluation and review to look at what was needed in the space of migration. We know that migration has changed extensively. I call it an umbrella term because it's a very significant policy programmatic area. It is increasingly diverse. It covers the full spectrum from forced through to voluntary migration, including the high-skilled end, and increasingly these days retirement migration as well. So we wanted to capture what was going on in migration across all of the geographies around the world, covering our member states and non-member states as well, and including a range of different topics. So we've turned it into a global reference report. We have extended the digital tools and the outputs that are available for a growing audience, and especially with thanks to our authors, our donors. And we've worked very extensively with the academic and policy communities to co-author, to co-edit, to peer review, to ensure that the quality is very high. One of the more challenging areas has been to get translations done, but we're particularly focusing on translations of official languages of developing countries. It's not very useful being at Capital and not speaking English or French or Spanish for member states to be able to use the report. So we have really put emphasis and been able to support that with donor funding, including Swahili, Portuguese, Turkish, and other languages. I think for the last two updates, we've looked at the global transformations, particularly focusing on what's going on around migration and displacement to try and situate it and make sense of some of the changes that we are seeing and what we will see into the future. We provided an update to the global transformations, geopolitical, environmental, and technological in this edition, in Chapter 1 of the World Migration Reports. And that is not to say, as a trained demographer, although a policy-oriented demographer, as James would mention, not a technical demographer, to downplay demography, to downplay the geographic, economic, and social transformations. And I really point to the work of people like Stephen Castles, among others. But it is to say that these are very intense at the moment, and we are seeing things change very rapidly and in real time, especially around the geopolitical transformations. Recommended viewing if you're very interested in the multilateral system and what that means. More broadly, the UN Secretary General's speech at Davos this year was a really phenomenal speech and quite a sobering Q&A following it. Here's just some examples. We know that the geopolitical environment involves, well, intense competition, but also, new conflicts that have emerged in the last 2 years, which we talk about in the World Migration Report. Multilateralism is under pressure. We have the Summit of the Future occurring in the next couple of weeks. Previously settled hotspots are increasingly at risk of erupting. It's a rather sobering assessment, but it is a realistic one. The technological changes have been profound and still unclear as to what they will mean in the longer term. I turn to the CEO of OpenAI, Sam Altman, who always says we don't exactly know what's going to happen with artificial intelligence, and certainly it's important to listen to him and listen to some of the changes that we are going to see in the future. In the context of this theme and this migration update, disinformation is particularly relevant, a highly relevant topic, and we'll be talking about that in the last panel later today. Environmental transformations, yes, climate change and climate change impacts, but much more than that. And that is an area that the international community is certainly tackling, trying to deal with in a very challenging environment. So for the World Migration Report for this edition, we have updated chapters 2 and 3. Chapter 2 is our global overview of migration and migrants. Chapter 3 is the regional dimensions. And then part 2, we change the thematic topics from report to really look at some of the key complex and emerging migration issues. So growing migration inequality, otherwise known as the Regular Pathways chapter, which shows that migration inequality is growing and has grown over the last 25 years. It is really the evidence base for why regular migration pathways are really critically important for the organisation, particularly around our strategic priorities at the moment. Migration and human security, gender and migration, a very interesting area and under-researched, of course. Climate change, we have provided a climate change and migration chapter for the last few editions, and this one is really looking at the deep dive into food insecurity as well as human mobility. Global governance, we have provided multiple updates on global governance. It is a moving space. I wouldn't say a fast-moving space, but it is certainly evolving, and we've seen some changes that are beyond the realisation of what people thought was possible in a currently challenged global governance area. And of course, with the help of Professor Gamlin, we did a post-pandemic rebound chapter looking at the longer-term transformations around COVID-19 and its impact on migration and mobility around the world. The report overview is really the big picture of migration. So if you only have a chance to look at one chapter, and they are intended to be read separately, I should add, this is the chapter that provides the overview in terms of the long-term data analysis, the long-term trends, and I've highlighted the key points if we want to do a 3-minute thesis. These are the key points that we would touch on, which I learn, of course, here at ANU. The majority of people do not move. They stay and live within the countries in which they're born in terms of international migration. Migration is a driver of human development. Now, that's a sort of slight understatement. Migration is a major global strategic asset, but we're at a paradox, which I'm sure will be talked about extensively today, in terms of having disinformation and undermining of international migration around the world at the same time as having it as a major global strategic asset, particularly in terms of international remittances, but far, far, far more than international remittances. Regular migration pathways boost public confidence in migration systems. This is certainly was front and centre when we were working on the Irregular Migration Research Program in Australia several years ago when I was with Home Affairs, as it was then Immigration and Border Protection. But the really important part too is that it also protects migrants. Regular pathways provide a form of protection, which isn't international protection, but it's a form of protection for people who are migrating and who are on the move, a critically important area. Humanitarian crises due to international displacement and internal displacement remain the exception. This is very clear from the data, but they are also on the rise, and we are seeing forced displacement, internal and cross-border, continue to ratchet up year on year on year. So a quick overview, we look at the international migrant stock data produced by UNDESA, the international migration flow data, much more difficult to actually analyse, so we use some OECD data and also some meta data there as well. And then we look at specific migrant groups and specific issues such as international remittances. I'll quickly take us through some of the key highlights with some pictures, some graphs. Pictures cover 1,000 words, as they say. We know that there is a growing global gender gap in migration. Yes, the number of international migrants who are female has increased in the last 22 years. 20 years or so, but it has not increased at the same rate as male international migrants. And you can see that on the left-hand side, but on the right-hand side, there are some little signals in there as to why this is. If you look at India, the top origin country of international migrants around the world, you can see with the sex disaggregated data, there's a very profound difference between male and female international migrants. On the left-hand side, the key destination countries, again, some indications in terms of what is happening. The US has higher numbers of female international migrants, but a lot of countries such as Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, for example, have very strong masculinized populations. Migration and development, we know this figure well, this graph. This is international remittance flows to low and middle income countries over 23 years or so. And we can see that notwithstanding some pretty dire projections around COVID-19, that the red line there, international remittance flows have not only remained resilient, but have continued to increase. Quite different compared to official development assistance, the line along the bottom, and very different to FDI, the foreign direct investment flows into low and middle income countries. I think this is why we would talk about international remittances and international migration as being a global strategic asset. Migrants and diaspora are active and some of the most active actors in terms of supporting the sustainable development goals through remittances, financial, social, and otherwise. We can see here in terms of remittance costs that things have changed between 2015 and 2022. As we know, it is an SDG target in terms of international remittance costs, but it's highly variable. And sub-Saharan Africa have some of the highest costs in terms of sending international remittances. Yes, they have come down, but we can look at Europe and Central Asia, which excludes the Russian Federation, and that picture hasn't changed. To get down to a global average of 3% as per the SDG target, there's a long way to go, but some very important work that can be done. Refugees and asylum seekers, we cover the full spectrum, as I mentioned. Again, this is a similar story around the highest ever in the modern day records that have been produced by UNHCR. We are seeing changes in real time very quickly. Of course, you can see 2022 data from Ukraine and the Russian Federation full-scale invasion of Ukraine represented there. Internal displacement is a somewhat different story. Internal displacement the data produced by the Internal Displacement Monitoring Centre, including with the support of IOM through its displacement tracking matrix, of course, shows that year on year, the conflict and violence internal displacement data is lower than disaster displacement. Here, disaster displacement, we're talking about wildfires, floods, hurricanes, earthquakes, etc., etc. But when we start to look at, and you can see the graph there, of course, Ukraine is in the 2022 data set, so very high conflict and violence internal displacement because of Ukraine in particular. But then when we look at internally displaced persons by the end of the year, we can see the reverse. Most people who are IDPs because of conflict and violence. It's protracted. As IDMC notes, it is more often than not that disaster internal displacement occurs in an orderly way and people can return after the disaster has subsided and it is safe to return to their homes. That is definitely not the case for internal displacement due to conflict and violence, which is protracted. In terms of the regional dimensions, this is a very large report. It is a report within a report, as some would say. We look at the 6 UN regions. I'm not going to take you through any of the findings here other than to show you, for example, how we use some of the data and the data visualization outputs to really highlight in a very crisp and clear way. If you need to do talking points for a minister, if you need to do background briefing, if you need to present and teach on migration, These are very, very useful outputs, and we find them used extensively because you can see very quickly on the left-hand side, Africa is a completely different set of dimensions across 30 years worth of data, international migrant stock data, compared to Latin America and the Caribbean. So you can automatically and very quickly see that geography is one of the key determining factors of international migration and displacement. Latin America and the Caribbean, of course, most migrants are moving from the region to other regions, particularly North America, and then within that it is the United States of America. One of the myths of migration is that people are migrating from the continent of Africa, but we can see here that still most people who are international migrants are migrating within the continent, not from it. That is likely to change in the future. However, the free mobility arrangements that are being set up and have operated within the continent are really designed to facilitate international migration, both within sub-regions and also more broadly across the continent. Here we're looking at internal displacement. You can see again very clearly the green is disaster, that kind of purple colour is conflict and violence. Very quickly that Africa on the right and Asia on the left have very distinct and very different patterns, with Asia dominating internal disaster displacement. This one I like to show because having worked on displacement, international displacement for many, many years in many different sort of capacities, it's unique that Africa, and particularly Eastern Horn of Africa, has a long-term pattern of having countries who are some of the largest host countries of refugees in the world, and also the largest origin countries in the world on the left-hand side. This features and is very prominent within Africa and Eastern Horn of Africa in particular, but it doesn't occur in any other part of the world. And we can see there on the right-hand side, Asia, for example, we've got Syria and Afghanistan as the two major origin countries of refugees. The World Migration Report Interactive Platform, we have spent quite a lot of time understanding and doing, as I mentioned, evaluations, reviews, feedback with our partners externally to try and understand how people use the reports, what they need out of a report, like a global reference report, the World Migration Report. And so we've invested, with the support of our donors, to be able to produce a DataViz interactive platform. Some of the outputs are not able to be done in a PDF report. For example, the country-to-country migration corridors, every country, both origin and destination, is included. I use it in my day-to-day work because it's much nicer than going into a very large Excel spreadsheet to be able to quickly see where the big dynamics are around the world. We're very lucky and very pleased to be winning multiple international awards for the DataViz platform. Quality assurance is really important. Alan knows this. We've lived that dream, haven't we? And also James has been a peer reviewer for us in the past. So we do extensive peer review, internal peer review, external peer review. We reject chapters if needed. We do full protocol referencing, primary, of course, reputable sources, so on and so forth, and full data checking, which I learned at Home Affairs, I must say. To data check outputs is critically important. It's not necessarily done in academia, but it is done extensively within government. It's a really important part of really adhering to a Senate estimates kind of level, shall we say, of process, and I think it has held us in very good stead to make sure that the data is as good as possible. It's never going to be completely perfect, but we do our best, that is for sure. Some of the partnership examples, we are really pleased and extremely grateful to be working with some of the best and brightest minds in the world on the World Migration Report, including to make it a genuine World Migration Report, not just a Global North migration report. So we want to be able to tap into and check in with migration scholars as well as applied researchers all around the world. I've just highlighted Linda Ucho's named there. She was the co-editor of the 2024 edition, and we've started work on the 2026 edition. Again, finally, with thanks to many in the room and also externally around the world, we have put a lot of effort into translating key outputs for developing countries so that they can access and not be locked out of accessing key data and information. We're also working, which I'll talk about in the last panel a bit more, we're working more and more with Gen AI companies to really test how their large language models are working, doing post-training assessments to make sure that the migration outputs are robust and not hallucinating, I think is the technical term, but not producing disinformation or misinformation. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Mari, for coming all the way down back home to be with us and for that fascinating overview of the World Migration Report. That brings our first session to a close. Thank you to Paul and to the Provost for being here as well, and to all the participants, of course. I'd now like to welcome the next panel to the stage. And while I'm doing that, I just have a few housekeeping items to go through. So the first one is just to, please do come up, and I can go through them while you're coming up. Just a reminder that today's discussions are on the record. Recordings are going to be uploaded to the Migration Hub website, and we plan to publish a conference proceedings report, so we'll be in touch with speakers about that. The restrooms, if you haven't found them already, are just out here. The fire exits also, if you go past the ladies' restrooms and gather in the car park should something happen, but I'm sure it won't if the alarms go off. The Wi-Fi details are around the building. It's basically, I think it's Academy Public, and there's no password required, so yeah, free Wi-Fi. For journalists, you're welcome to set up in the Becker room, which is over here. There's plenty of space and connectivity there. Rebecca is our media person, our key media person. Rebecca, could you just put your hand up? She might be in the media room already. So we'll have breaks throughout the day, including lunch at 12:15, so you'll be well fed and well caffeinated. And food for those with dietary requirements is segregated off into what I'm calling the vegetarian ghetto. We don't normally support spatial segregation, but that's how the venue works. So yeah, I can see the next panel are ready to go now. So that's all from me, except to say thank you so much for being with us today, and we hope you enjoy the program that we put together, and please join in the discussions.
Hi everyone. My name is Sanushka Mudliar. I am the director of the Red Crescent Global Migration Lab, and I'd like to welcome you to our first panel of today, and to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land. In thinking about the global trends and the global picture to shape the discussion that we're going to have today, I was reflecting on the role. I work for a small team within Australian Red Cross that focuses on research and policy to help Red Cross organisations globally interpret and analyse the data they receive through their migration operations. And we're really in a position to see the human impact of the global trends, some of which we'll discuss today, in immigration policy and the way in which they shape the activities and operations of humanitarian organisations. From our perspective, the global picture is one of rising humanitarian need and shrinking space for humanitarian response. But as Marie indicated a few moments ago, that's really a small part of a much bigger picture around the reality of global migration. So with that in mind, I would like to call our first speaker today for a panel that's going to talk about global trends. So we're going to start off talking about the Pacific context closer to home and labour mobility between Australia, New Zealand and Pacific Island countries. And then we're going to move into a more global picture looking at America and the politics of migration in that context and the way in which it feeds into the global context, before looking towards global governance and the recent discussions around evaluating and assessing the Global Compact on migration. So first up, we have Dr. Ryan Edwards, who's the Deputy Director of the Development Policy Centre at the Crawford School at ANU. His research lies at the intersection of development, labour and migration economics, international trade and the environment. He mostly works on Australia, Indonesia and the Pacific, and is the lead for the Australian Government's Pacific Research Program from a migration perspective. He is associated with the MIT Poverty Action Lab, Innovations for Poverty Action and the ANU Migration Hub, as well as the Arndt Corden Department of Economics. Please welcome Dr. Ryan Edwards.
Who's controlling the slides? Can I? First, thank you, Alan and Chanel, for the generous introduction, and Paul for the very warm welcome as well. Here we go. Can I control them too? So my name's Ryan, for those of you who don't know me, although I see from the audience many familiar faces. Thanks for coming down. I'm going to try and give a pretty fast whirlwind overview of where things stand at the moment with Australia-Pacific migration. So some of you may be quite familiar with this content, hopefully some less so. Okay, here we go, it's working. So the general structure I'm working with, we're going to start with, so who's in Australia at the moment? Why are they here? And what's that look like in terms of the stock? Then we'll fast forward to current Pacific labour mobility, and in many ways we've sort of entered a modern era. Things have changed a lot with the so-called Pacific Step Up from 2016. Then I'm going to sort of hopefully push everyone a little bit out of their comfort zone a bit and say, well, we've had some pretty huge leaps and bounds and successes in how Australia approaches labour mobility in the Pacific. What can we learn for the rest of our migration program from these successes? And how can we question the way that we've been doing things so far? So first up, in terms of the stock. So we'll start this with levels and trends, a little bit on country of origin and heritage, and then how can we explain why these patterns look the way they do today? And I'll briefly talk through, as we start to shift more from thinking about it from a temporary and circular perspective to more of a life cycle perspective, what do we know about the current economic situation of those in Australia? So this figure here, which you'll see, this is just using the census data back to 2006, and sort of the story there is that it's more or less, the stock has more or less doubled in the last 20 years of people with Pacific Island heritage. But as a share of the population, it's still very, very small. It's about 1.3% in 2021, probably a little bit more today. And then in terms of where people are actually coming from, it's very much Fiji, Samoa, Tonga, and Cook Islands, and then PNG. And as many of you are probably aware, if you were to scale this by population size, some of these are quite small countries, right? PNG is obviously the biggest one. And the dark line that you see here relative to the more cream one, that's 21 versus 2006. So you see where the growth has been. And the growth has, of course, been in those that had the first mover advantage, that already had the routes planted, that had the network, that had the pathways in place, that could work off that basis. So three main explanations. At least these are the best explanations that I could conjure up. The first one is obviously White Australia policy. We can't go past that when looking at the history. And when we got away from White Australia policy, what did we shift towards? We shifted towards this razor-sharp focus on skills and our skills system that has dominated the discourse ever since. And if you compare, for example, the stock of the Australian PNG population versus the UK Caribbean population, looks starkly different, right, in terms of those that are here and how they're here. And so we've got this historic underrepresentation, given the really close connection, which you don't see if you look across the Tasman to New Zealand, right? Pacific Islanders are much better represented in New Zealand. The second reason is really the skilled Indo-Fijians. So this was happening before the 1989 coup, but Fiji has really for a long time been the only country that's been quite competitive from the Pacific in our skill system. And so this is these graphs on the top, which is a lot going on, so don't try and understand them too much. These are from a nice paper by two of my friends, Michael Clemens and Satish Chand. Satish is not here, but, and this studies the effect of the coup on human capital and skills investment in Fiji. And what you see is the population of Indo-Fijians basically tapered off as soon as the coup happened, whereas the rest of it kept on rising normally. And then we had this huge spike to Australia that more or less has continued since then. And that was because people enrolled in the degrees at USP, at the National University of Fiji, that allowed them to basically go straight through the skills system pretty fast and effectively. Other countries are typically not competitive for our skills visas. And then the big reason as well is what's the New Zealand pathway. Australia obviously has pretty lax in fact, open labour market arrangements with New Zealand. And New Zealand has quite open arrangements with lots of Polynesian countries, historically, but also through very specific programs that emerged because of the historical circumstances, such as the Samoan quota and the Pacific Access category for Tongans. And so New Zealanders have unlimited access to Australia, and then ergo Pacifica New Zealanders have good access to Australia too. So that's how most of them got here. And this is the main channel that explains the diaspora here. But if you think about it, and you think about how we are engaging with the Pacific and Pacific communities, this is an incredibly indirect and costly and inefficient pathway for people to come here. So like about 4% of Samoans in Australia today came here directly. They all came, if you see on this bottom right chart, bottom right from where you are, left from where I am. Look at the share of Samoans that came here directly versus jumped over by New Zealand. And this path is pretty inequitable because most of the countries that need the migration opportunities the most, so I'm talking about Papua New Guinea, Solomons, Vanuatu, they're the ones that don't have access to PR in New Zealand, which is historically focused on Polynesia. So how do people do once they get to Australia? So this is some earlier analysis that a former colleague, Elizabeth Lawson, put together. And what she did too was just basically go through the census outcomes and compare how Pacific Islanders are doing in the census versus how Australians are doing. It's a very sort of straightforward, naive-ish comparison, that basically we found higher employment rates in general, and they were more likely to be in the labour force than the average resident. And this is those that have been here for a long time in the 2016 census, because we did it a while ago. Things may have changed a bit since then, but probably not too much. And of course, occupation and industry spread is quite gendered. It's hard to say whether it's much more gendered than you'd expect for the Australian population in general, because we haven't done that analysis, but most men work in manufacturing and construction and warehousing, and more than half work as labourers or in trade sectors, and women typically work in healthcare and social assistance and retail as well. And then you can see there the occupations. The most common level of educational attainment though, however, this is one, I think, the important issue, is secondary school. So it's not post-secondary, it's sort of relatively lower skill level. And then if you look at the income distribution across all the different bins that we would see in the way that we normally report it in the census, it's pretty even. There's no curve. People are pretty even from lower income up to higher income, evenly distributed across all the bins, which I haven't put here, but it's up on our website if you wanted to look further. Over to where we sit today. Modern Pacific labour mobility, which is what you hear about mostly in the news these days. So I'm going to give you a really brief, a pretty short recent history. That history is going to start less than 20 years ago, which would be the pilot seasonal worker program, which then became the seasonal worker program. For those of you remember, it was staunchly resisted in the 2000s, right? It was not popular. Instead, we just extended the backpacker arrangements more. But it was eventually introduced in 2008 as a pilot due to it being advocated for a long time and at the wish of many Pacific countries. Then SWP was introduced in 2012, and then it grew in the late 2010s due to a bunch of sort of demand-side reforms, following a pretty slow start. It is employer-sponsored and demand-driven, and it's modelled on New Zealand's recognised seasonal employer scheme, which many see as best practice. And back then, really, the political settlement that got this over the line, both in sending countries and in Australia, was that these are temporary workers, it's circular, there's no brain drain here, you're all going home after. And so that evolved to them largely being permanent temporary workers, which is, I guess, where the friction is today and where it's now moving towards a more sort of life cycle, longer term approach. So from there, then the Pacific Labour Scheme was announced in 2019, taking off exactly from that, where you had longer stays. You were not just in agriculture and hospitality anymore, and you could come in at slightly higher skill levels, earn a bit more, and because it was no longer in these heavily gendered sectors, you might expect it to be a bit more gender balanced. That didn't play out. It was mostly dominated by men and meatpacking, so meat sector so far. That was merged with the SWP a few years later, quite recently, into the PALM scheme, which we know today, the Pacific Australia Labour Mobility Scheme, which retains these short and long stay streams under the one scheme. And there's a series of other reforms that typically increased regulation and made the short stay much less seasonable and flexible for employers. The Australia-facing part is run out of DEWA, and the Pacific-facing part is run out of DFAT, largely via a contractor, at least to date. This is my old set of slides. Okay, sorry the text is so small. I actually spread these out so that you didn't have to squint so much like me. But then, so these next two are sort of a new era of sorts. This is where we're moving towards permanent places. So the Pacific Engagement Visa took a while to get through Parliament because it was quite controversial. We haven't ever historically allocated places to live in the country randomly or by a lottery or by a ballot. It's a new ballot. It's giving 3,000 places per year, and those quotas are spread across about 10 countries, 10 countries. It's similar to and modelled on New Zealand's PAC, but has different countries, largely those that are not getting access to PAC. And it's also modelled on the US diversity visa. So migration lotteries are not particularly new or special. We're largely a latecomer to this party, and there's a lot of reasons why they're fantastic, actually. It's skill neutral in theory, meaning that anyone can apply. But in practice, the way that the process works and what you need to apply will see some quite strong degree of selection in who actually makes it into that pool and then has a random chance of success in going through. Because you have to get a job offer after getting selected, and obviously most PALM and temporary visa holders here can already apply. And so we'll have the resources to go for that. Then after that, we've had the Australia-Tuvalu-Whalapeiri Union Treaty announced, which was a sort of security/labour market access agreement with Tuvalu. It's similar to a compact idea that Glenn, Satish, many others have discussed at length and advocated for. It's starting with 280 places per year, which might sound small, but that's actually 2.5% of the domestic population. So it's quite significant for the country. I don't know how I'm going on time, but I'm just going to keep going. That's okay. I can whiz through this stuff. So now I'm going to talk a bit about the theme is countering facts and countering data. So we've got this big project that we've been doing for a number of years called the Pacific Labour Mobility Survey. And what this is, what we were trying to do with this was collect some large-scale representative data on these schemes. Because a lot of what you hear in the media is not that representative, right? I'm an economist, we're researchers, we like data a lot. And so what we do, we tried to cover sort of as many as we could to start with. It's covering all three schemes, so it gives you a comparative perspective. So the first wave was Australia, New Zealand, Kiribati, Tonga and Vanuatu. The samples were quite large, so we've got over 2,000 workers, 2,010 migrants back home, and importantly, also over 2,000 non-sending households, which can function as a control group of sorts to make some comparisons and do some more rigorous analysis. We're in the process now of expanding to 8 countries, which is very exciting, and there's a report out and a whole bunch that we've sort of analysed and written about it that you can find through my website or through the other websites. But I was just going to give you sort of a preview of some of the main facts that do jump out of it. So one of the things I'm quite interested in is sort of the pull factor for people to work here, what's known as the place premium, what you get from taking your initial level of skills and endowments and then moving to a different place in the world. How do your earnings change? Well, for Tonga, it's between 3 and 4 times what you would get pre-departure. But for Vanuatu, which is obviously a slightly lower income country than Tonga, it's 9 to 10 times the earning gains of what you had in the labour market before you left. And then what we find, there's concerns that people might not be actually earning enough to get by. Cost of living here is rising, we've got the housing crisis and so forth. But we find that about 60% of earnings do remain to be saved or remitted after their living expenses and deductions. Deductions are a big cost to workers. And because my colleagues at the World Bank did a similar study of the seasonal worker program in 2008, we can compare what these patterns look like over time. And we actually find that people are retaining a larger share of their earnings since then, despite what's been going on with inflation and cost of living over time. So that's a good news story. And in terms of the overall share of what you have left, we've got more detailed data from a project called the Remittance Diaries. And what you see here is the weekly time series of what some people working in the PALM scheme, but in the long stay PALM scheme, would be getting per week. And you see there's a pretty robust and big gap between how much is being sent home in remittances, total income that you get, and then your expenses. And if you add your remittance to your expenses, then there's still a pretty big gap left for savings, right? They're not close to each other or statistically overlapping at all. And then in terms of worker satisfaction, so one of the biggest concerns that I guess partly motivated this work to try and help us get some more facts was all the media reporting about all the exploitation that goes on in the scheme. And then there's a sort of an empirical question, is it increasing in prevalence? Or is it just a function of size, going from a few thousand up to 40,000, right? What's this actually coming from and where it is? Well, what we find that over time, if you look at the prevalence, people are still voting with their feet. 92% of the workers do want to come and work in the scheme again, and about 50% want to come as many times as possible. And the self-reported ratings of satisfaction, which you've all filled in satisfaction surveys before, you know their pros and cons, those ratings have remained pretty constant over the time during the pandemic, during the scheme's growth, and during a whole bunch of reforms that have happened as well. And if you delve more deeply into certain specific dimensions of satisfaction and dissatisfaction, we got heaps of individual responses as to why people were not happy and where there's room for improvement. But say if you look at how you're treated by your employer or your accommodation settings, virtually all people are saying things are okay and pretty good. And I might skip over this one, but one other thing that jumped out when you look at the actual earnings and the hours data in the labour force part of the survey is that low hours are not actually the problem that was really commonly believed. So DILA put in place a whole bunch of reforms to try and mandate a minimum hour of workers each week, which meant that the scheme was becoming much less flexible for ag, right? Because you can't commit to giving someone 35, 38 hours every week if you're a farmer. That's pretty hard. But what we see here is that, so this is the distribution of hours. And if you look at those that are getting, actually this one's probably the best one to look at. So what we've got here is the SWP and the PLS. The PLS, you're guaranteed 38 hours because it's a full-time contract. And then SWP, no, because you're casuals. But then if you look at the distribution of hours below that full-time mark, they overlap each other incredibly well. There's not that much difference in those that are getting full-time on the casual versus the contract, which is quite indicative that not that big an issue. And then you go down here into the cumulative probability and you see the exact same thing. It's a very small share. So I'll wrap up with, I was going to talk about a study that we're in the process of doing at the moment, but I know I'm getting very close to time to be cut off. So we've got a new paper that's about to come out, so I'll just stay tuned on this one, where we actually look at the impacts of these schemes on the outcomes of people who are incumbent Australian workers in the same communities and the same sectors. And the findings are actually quite interesting. It was a surprise. We find very, very small positive effects. And most of the story is really, it's not on them and what they're doing at the moment and on their wages, but what they could be doing. It's on mobility. It's on people working in different jobs because people have moved into these sectors and taken the jobs that they didn't so much want. So it's in terms of regional mobility and moving to higher occupations. So the final 3 points that I was just going to end with, the 6 lessons, if you'll allow me to. Yes, that's okay, sorry. So, thanks to many people in the room, the Pacific Australia migration corridors are now probably the most studied part of our migration program that we have. And we've got more evidence on it than kind of anywhere else. And that has seen a lot of reforms and a lot of policy successes. So the first lesson, I guess, is that this type of surveys and this type of data and this type of qualitative research that's been going on for decades by colleagues at the back of the room has been incredibly helpful for informing policy. And we should be doing more of it, and not just in the Pacific. Second, I think PALM shows us quite nicely, as does work by my colleague Tuan Nguyen, that these uncapped and demand-driven schemes are quite helpful in a multi-speed economy like Australia at addressing regional labour shortages and the ebbs and flows associated with a business cycle, as opposed to those that are not demand-driven. And then but the random ballots. So it was really controversial to put the lottery through Parliament, but as it turns out, many visas are oversubscribed, and this is an efficient and a fair mechanism. And there's now other visas that are also being advocated by lottery. It's not well advertised, but if you trawl through the Home Affairs website enough, you'll start to notice that there's a couple more that this is now how it's being done as well. And this setup is quite nice because it means that it's unbiased in terms of skills and then reduces brain drain concerns amongst partner countries, which is still a huge concern. I'm personally not a big brain drain believer, but that doesn't mean it's not a real concern and an issue for sending countries. And then last, there's been a whole of government approach in sort of affecting how we approach the Pacific. So this has affected policy success in many other areas, such as foreign policy development elsewhere. Integration in the past has much more strongly emphasized trade than it has migration and labour mobility. And usually that's just because of the politics, because it's too hard. But we know the gains are much bigger. So we could definitely do more on that going forward. And then the last final point I would say is that Pacific migration, the more I study, the more I learn about it, is making it quite clear that unskilled is at least as important as skilled migration here. And there's a quote here by a pretty well-known economist that the curious task of economics is to demonstrate to men just how little they really know about what they imagine they can design. And we're really not that good at identifying the skills and sectors. And we've got probably the most skill-biased migration program in the world, which means there's nowhere else to go in terms of making it more skilled and more specialised. So we should probably look at some other margins to improve things, if that's what we want to do. But yeah, I'll leave it there. Thank you for the extension. And I hope there was something interesting for everyone.
Thank you so much. There's a lot more to delve into there, of huge interest. Our next speaker is Professor Philip Martin, who is the Emeritus Professor in the Global Migration Centre at the University of California, Davis. He has a reputation which precedes him as an effective analyst working on complex and controversial migration and labour issues. He has received UC Davis's Distinguished Public Service Award in '94 and is a member of the Binational Study of Migration between '95 and '97 and has worked on a range of major academic appointments for the US government. Please welcome Professor Martin.
Well, good morning and thank you. And I want to thank Alan and all of you for being here as we go back across the Pacific to North America. As the slides come up, the way we always sort of introduce international migration is to say, look at Europe, has about 10% of the world's people, about 1/3 of the world's migrants. Asia, 60% of the world's people, also about 1/3 of the world's migrants. And North America, 5% of the world's people and about 25% of the world's migrants. But of course, Oceania would be even a smaller share of the world's people and a higher share of the world's migrants. So we're looking basically at Canada and the United States. And what we're looking at are two traditional countries of immigration. And I think the takeaway message is that Canada remains probably the model country, a country with a very high level of migration, general public trust in the government managing migration, a government able to move fairly quickly. Right now, you'll see the two issues are foreign students and temporary foreign workers, and the government is moving to crack down or reduce the numbers in both. And then we move south to the US, a country with a lower share of migrants as a percentage of the population than Canada. Canada's 22% foreign born, US is 15%, but a country where migration issues have become very controversial. So if this is going to move, somebody's going to tell me how to make this thing advance. Where's the clicker that makes it move? Sorry? Click, there we go. So Canada, the great exception among the industrial countries. It's the place that's had high levels of migration for a long time. Canadian immigration policy roughly mirrors US immigration policy in the sense that the peak numbers and the peak number of migrants as a share of population was just before World War I. Then Canada, like the United States, closed itself off to immigrants from Asia. But Canada, unlike the United States, in the mid-60s developed a point system, very similar to the Australian system, so that you get priority to entry if you have education and skills that are likely to help you integrate quickly. So Canada is a country of a little over 40 million people. It plans for the immigration of roughly 500 newcomers a year. Over half of them have to be in a family in which one person satisfies these requirements. In the past, it was what economists would call a supply-side approach. Do you have a lot of education? Do you speak the language? Are you young? Now it's much more a demand-side approach. The points for having a Canadian job offer and Canadian work experience have increased a lot because there were too many PhDs and doctors driving taxis in places like Toronto. So just because you have the credentials doesn't necessarily mean you'll get a job that uses them. The big issue, the big two issues in Canada now are foreign students, and that may sound familiar here in Australia, and low-skilled temporary workers. So Canada has 1 million foreign students, 40 million population. The United States has 1.5 million foreign students, 335 million population. Canada's got a lot of private universities that appeal to or that advertise in India to come to Canada. And why do you come to Canada? Because you get to work 40 hours a week when there's no school, 20 hours a week when school's in session, and that's really hard to monitor. So basically, these are diploma mills that are acting as guest worker agents for low-skilled workers. The issue is, when you find a truly fraudulent one, who's the victim? The victim is the foreign student who paid all the money and is now going to be deported because, after all, they don't have a valid student visa. Some of these schools never actually had a physical building. They just operated Zoom. So there's a crackdown on what's coming. And then the other issue is low-skilled temporary workers. We could talk more about that, but let me switch to something on the U.S. and immigrants. So immigration is one thing I never studied, so I didn't ever intend to do immigration, but I used to work at a think tank called the Brookings Institution. We had a president then, when I was very young, named Carter, who was an engineer. He had a plan for everything, and he had a plan to deal with what was called illegal aliens, and that's the way the official government documents described it at the time. And there was a meeting at the White House, and they said, AgEcon, California. So I wound up working for a few years on this. And I think if there's any lesson I tell my students, just because a government tackles a problem doesn't mean you solve it. In 1986, when we passed our big immigration reform, legalized almost 3 million unauthorized foreigners, put in place sanctions, we had roughly 3 million unauthorized foreigners in the US. Now we have 11 million. So just because you do something doesn't mean you solve the problem. So what the story in the United States is we are a country of immigration. We had a low point in 1970, and that had to do with policies put in place in the 1920s. Then we changed our system. Unlike Canada, we did not go points, we went family unification. The way to immigrate to the United States is to have a family member already settled there. And one of the big myths about the United States is they say you can't come legally. Why is that? Because the US has one of the world's most expansive definitions of family. I can bring in my parents. I can bring in children to the age of 21. We allow US citizens to bring in their married brothers and sisters. Typical thing, you come as a foreign student, you find an employer, you become an immigrant, and then by the time you become an immigrant and you're in their 30s, you bring in your brothers and sisters and their families. So why is the wait to come as an immigrant to bring in family from India or the Philippines 30 years? Because we have the most expansive definition of family of any country in the world. And so therefore, we have a system that is family-based. And what has happened is that historically, immigrants to the US came from Europe. Now they are coming increasingly from Latin America and the Caribbean, and Mexico accounts for about 1/4 of the immigrants. So as I said, the thing I worked on turned into what was called the Immigration Reform and Control Act. Everybody said, this is it, from now on, we won't have unauthorized migration to the US. And remember, a Republican president signed it, and that was supposed to solve things. It did not solve things. We moved the next step and we said trade in place of migration. So famously, Carlos Salinas, the president of Mexico, went to Europe in 1990 and said, hey, you know, we want foreign investment in Mexico. We're going to change our economic model. Would you Germans and French invest in Mexico? And they said, you know, did you remember in 1989 the Berlin Wall fell? And now there's a lot of opportunities in our own backyard in Eastern Europe. Why don't you look to the US? So people don't realize Mexico proposed NAFTA, not the US. And so the Mexican president said, look, if you free up trade, that is you, the United States and Canada, we will send you tomatoes and not tomato pickers. That was a famous quote from Salinas. Well, what happened? Mexico sent more tomatoes. 60% of the tomatoes eaten in the US come from Mexico. But they also sent more tomato pickers. So if you eat a tomato that's grown in Canada, the US, or Mexico, it's picked by a Mexican. So in all three countries, we basically have integrated economies, integrated migration. Mexico's had a lot of different policies, and it's important to keep in mind that with Mexico, migration relationships came before trade. And the tradition in Mexico was that the outgoing president spent a ton of money in the year of the election, and then the peso would be devalued. That's exactly what happened in 1994. And so even though it wasn't necessarily NAFTA's fault, NAFTA got blamed. And we had this huge surge in unauthorized migration from Mexico. So we got up to roughly 1 out of 10 people born in Mexico was living in the US. And 2/3 of them were not legally authorized to be there. I mean, it really was a huge surge in migration. What did the US do? We put up fences and walls on the border. The border is 2,000 miles long, about 800 has fences, and this is roughly the way it looks. And the big thing was that as the number of Mexicans and Latin Americans increased, remember, it rose a lot, trade went up, migration went up, states, you know, we have 50 states, they took different approaches toward the migrants. Many of the southeastern states said, we don't want unauthorized people here. And so they passed laws that said, even though the federal government should keep people out, we will make it a state crime to be in this state illegally, without the legal right to be in the US. So that was the Southeast. Other states, including California, said, no, we're going to integrate you. And so they started issuing driver's licenses. They've got a very confused policy, and that's still the way it is today. Your legal status depends on, or what you can do depends on where you live. And then, of course, that was the sort of situation when we got to 2015 and 16 with Mr. Trump. So Hillary Clinton, remember, had 38 priorities if she was elected. Trump had 7. 3 of which were stop illegal immigration, no Muslims, build the wall, all that sort of thing. He was elected, so he said, we're going to build this wall. Now, if you look at the wall, that's the wall. The man's in Mexico, he's climbing at the top. You go in, what you don't see are the ropes that somebody's going to throw him so they can get over the top. So we have this wall at about 1/3 of the border. And in 2020, Mr. Biden said, we're going to stop building the wall. And that's exactly what he did. We stopped building the wall. We had to pay off the contractors that Trump had paid because they had put their material there, but we said we're not building it. And there was no deportations. That sent a different signal. And people in Central America then started saying, well, we'll come to the United States and we will apply for asylum on the basis that there really are lots of gangs and crime violence. And that was Ms. Harris's job, was to go to Central America and South America, deal with the root causes, something that's very familiar with in the international organizations. And so that's the big dilemma in places like Mexico and Central America. Do you wait for improvements at home or migrate to the US and apply for asylum? And the procedure takes roughly 4 years. So the big story is that so when you're trying to get into the US, you either come across without being detected or you try to sneak in at a port of entry. And so we call those encounters. And what's been happening is that the number of people encountered who are from Mexican citizens have gone down. The number of people encountered who are from other countries has gone up. And the real question, so this is where it goes from US policy to international policy, is The question is, how much are you going to chip away at the current refugee and asylum system? Essentially, the asylum system as it now exists in the US is a 4-year guest worker permit. If you can get in, basically you will have the right to work about 4 years before, remember, 85% of Central Americans are denied. But in the time that it takes to get that first decision and appeal. So the idea was, since we don't want to change that, we're simply going to block the border when the numbers get too high. And that was this bipartisan deal that Trump did. And the notion is, if too many people apply, we stop the border and nobody applied. And it was said Democrats would never agree to that. They did, but Trump closed it. So what Biden did last month in June was he said, we're going to use a variation on that. We're going to close the border when the average number of people encountered is over 2,500 a day. But being the Democrats, I happen to be a Democrat as well, I worked for a Democratic president, we're also going to protect unauthorized people who are married to US citizens. So where do we stand? We don't have any answers. And the last slide is, you know, if you want to summarize it, Canada is not going to reduce the number of immigrants. They will reduce foreign students and possibly guest workers. The US is still debating what to do about the unauthorized, whether to legalize them or deport them or some combination. But I do think the main message is that migration has moved up on the political agenda. And it gets mixed up with a whole lot of other things. You know, high prices for housing. We had a whole lot of, so if you're under 18, you get to come in even if the border's closed. So what happened? A whole lot of parents sent their 16-year-old kids to so-called relatives in the US. They put the kids to work in meatpacking plants. And New York Times did big exposés. There are major differences between the political parties, and it's not clear where we're going to go. The last word, my last 30 seconds is, I don't know what the correct answer. I happen to be in favor of migration. I think it should be managed. I think it's good. But for 200 years, economists have taught about comparative advantage. You know, let Portugal produce the wine, let England produce the wool, and they trade, and they're both better off. Guess what? We're moving backward from that. 200 years of economic education has not persuaded Mr. Trump and all of his advisors that that's a good theory. Even the Democrats in the US are moving away from free trade, slapping those tariffs on the Tesla cars out of China, or not the Tesla, whatever they are, the electric cars out of China. I mean, I don't know what the way forward is. I think it's admirable that we're looking at facts and disinformation. But we might want to learn from some of the other areas where there's a lot of controversy and things are not moving smoothly in an upward direction. Trade would not be a very good analogy for, I mean, I hope we don't go in migration the way it looks like we may go in trade. But anything I think we can do to move in a better direction, I think would be good for all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Martin. I think you're capturing the dilemma that we're here today to discuss, if not solve. Our final panellist today is Dr. Rasika Jayasuriya. She has over 2 decades of experience in migration and human rights across government, multilateral and civil society sectors. She served as a policy specialist at UNICEF and the UN Network on Migration in Geneva, and also worked with the Australian government at a federal and state level. She has a PhD from the University of Melbourne and was a doctoral associate at the University of Toronto. She's going to speak to us today about the global policy situation and her work with the UN Secretariat.
Thanks, Anushka. And I'll just wait for the slides to come up and I just click right. Is it correct? Okay. Yeah, it's a real pleasure to speak with you all here today alongside Ryan and Philip. Okay, great. Yeah, we know that today's migration movements are really not simple, and we know that they are not one-dimensional. Rather, they're driven by multiple intersecting factors, and sometimes these are complementary, and sometimes they're conflicting. In today's world, unilateral responses simply don't meet unfolding migration trends and challenges, which are complex, global in nature, and cannot be met by one country alone. I'm going to need some help to change the slides. Okay, great, thank you. The international community recognised this in 2018 with the adoption of the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration. This was a significant milestone in international migration governance, being the first ever multilateral instrument to cover migration in all of its dimensions. The Compact provides a framework for international cooperation, emphasising the collective responsibility of states in efforts to realise effective, humane and rights-based migration governance. Today, in discussing some of the global trends that we're seeing in migration governance, I hope to highlight how Australia, while not having yet endorsed the Compact, is effectively contributing to its implementation through its actions. It is encouraging that we've seen more countries, and particularly countries like the USA, voice support for the Compact and its vision, recognising its value as a tool providing common language for discussing migration and translating established principles and rights into migration contexts. I'm sharing this excerpt on the slide from the USA's adoption of the GCM because I believe that it highlights the Compact's very essence: to enhance cooperation to manage migration in ways that are grounded in human rights, transparency, non-discrimination, responsibility sharing, and state sovereignty, reaffirming the sovereign right of states to govern migration within their jurisdiction, while also critically recognising that international migration is an inherently transnational phenomenon that no state can or should address alone. We've also now seen 35 countries become official champions of the Global Compact, including countries like Canada. In terms of trends, I see these across two trajectories: worrying practices and promising developments. There is no shortage of worrying trends in global migration governance. We have the externalisation of border and migration procedures without procedural safeguards. For example, the EU's externalisation of migration and asylum processes to border countries through its Migration and Asylum Pact increases risks of rights violations at borders, including pushbacks and the immigration detention of children. There's the increasing securitisation of migration, which includes the criminalisation of irregular migration in ways that keep undocumented migrants in situations of vulnerability and destitution. And there's the compounding of racial profiling and discrimination through digital technologies used for screening and border enforcement. While technological advancements can enhance migration governance, they also pose challenges, like the rise of data privacy concerns and the potential for disproportionate surveillance, which warrant additional measures to safeguard migrants' rights. We have the continued death of migrants in transit, with 2023 being the deadliest year recorded in the past decade in terms of loss of life on migration routes, with migrants continuing to be pushed towards dangerous migration routes because of a lack of safe and regular migration pathways, and with people providing humanitarian assistance to migrants in distress being criminalised. Technology is both exacerbating and masking human trafficking. In 2022, we saw a global reduction of 11% in detected human trafficking cases for the first time in 20 years, but this was not because human trafficking has reduced, but because exploitation has become more and more hidden. And trends show that child trafficking is not decreasing. Rather, it continues to be one of the most egregious violations of child's rights globally, with children comprising 1/3 of all human trafficking victims. And we've seen the rise of xenophobia in mainstream discourse, and this is clearly reflected in the xenophobic messages that have been rife across national election campaigns in this year's Global Year of Democracy. I'm sure many of these worrying trends will be touched on in this afternoon's session. So I really want to focus on some promising developments in global migration governance that speak to positive trends, including practices that offer opportunities for replication and scaling up. I believe that across countries of destination, transit and origin, we're seeing a growing awareness and a growing appreciation of the interplay between migration and other global agendas, including in relation to sustainable development, climate change, public health and the global economy. There is also a growing understanding of how contemporary migration cuts across the humanitarian and development spectrum and cannot be neatly separated out from the many factors that influence people's movement, be it global inequalities, conflicts, natural disasters, labour market demands, family reunification, so on. There's certainly been an increased recognition of the link between climate change and migration and displacement, as Mari spoke about, and we know that millions of people are displaced each year due to environmental factors. UNICEF has estimated that in 2020 alone, weather-related events displaced nearly 9.8 million children. Governments worldwide are recognising this link, embedding human mobility and international climate action plans and disaster risk reduction strategies. It is also reflected in the inclusion of human mobility in the scope of the Loss and Damage Fund that states agreed to operationalise at COP28. And countries like Australia have recognised the need to expand regular migration pathways from countries particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, as called for in the Global Compact, which is demonstrated by Australia's Climate and Security Treaty with Tuvalu that Ryan talked about, which creates a special visa pathway for Tuvaluans to live, study and work in Australia. In transitioning to environmentally sustainable economies, constituents at the 2023 International Labour Conference, including Australia, stressed the need for coherence between just transition frameworks and labour mobility schemes, ensuring decent work and social protection for migrant workers. I think this reflects a growing recognition among states of the importance of respecting and protecting the dignity and rights of migrant workers and their families in both law and in practice, with an increasing realisation of the value of labour migration and migrant workers to destination countries, particularly in the wake of COVID, and the reality that unless labour mobility schemes are rights-based in their construction and execution, they cannot and will not deliver sustainable development outcomes. There is still a long way to go, with migrant workers around the world continuing to be employed in conditions that undermine their fundamental rights at work and remaining 3 times more highly exposed to the risk of forced labour than nationals. Again, Australia is leading the way in promising developments with its recent laws that decriminalise undocumented workers, that introduce the Workplace Justice Visa, and protect migrant workers who are taking action against their employer from having their visa cancelled. We're also seeing a shift in understanding the potential of migration to contribute to sustainable development beyond the narrow conception of remittance-based development, and this includes increasing efforts to foster the financial inclusion of migration workers and their families, and to support sustainable reintegration for returning migrants to reduce the likelihood of re-migration, including through promoting decent work opportunities in countries of origin. International cooperation to counter human trafficking and migrant smuggling is increasing, with a growing number of regional and global alliances and frameworks. Just last year, ASEAN leaders adopted a declaration on combating trafficking in persons caused by the abuse of technology, and the UN's Interagency Coordination Group against Trafficking in Persons launched a call to states for accelerated action to prevent and end child trafficking. Australia's leadership role in the Bali process reflects this importance of partnerships and regional cooperation in addressing human trafficking, as does its membership of the We Protect Alliance, which brings together governments, civil society and the private sector to develop policies and solutions to protect children from sexual exploitation and abuse online, which includes in the context of trafficking. The pandemic shone a light on the risks to people and to communities of policies and practices that, in their effect, exclude migrants, particularly undocumented and vulnerable migrants, from accessing basic services, including healthcare and education. It highlighted to policymakers the very real need for firewalls between immigration enforcement and service providers to ensure that migrants can access basic services without fear. A positive global development is that in May this year, the 77th World Health Assembly prioritised the health of migrants and refugees for the first time in the World Health Organization's 14th General Programme of Work, introducing specific indicators to track equal access to essential and emergency healthcare from 2025 to 28. This reflects a global recognition of the right to health for every person, regardless of their migration status, as well as, once again, highlighting the increasing awareness of how migration intersects with and influences global policy agendas. Another notable trend is an increasing recognition of the importance of multi-stakeholder engagement on migration issues at the global level, reflecting an understanding that effective migration governance cannot be achieved by governments alone, but requires collaboration with various actors, including civil society, the private sector, academia, and international organisations, to bring that diversity in perspective and expertise that is needed to foster innovative, people-centred, and nuanced solutions to complex migration challenges. Cities have become central actors in global discussions on migration, highlighting the reality that migration-related policy decisions frequently have the most acute impact at the local level, and local governments are often best placed to identify, understand, and respond to the needs of migrant populations in their communities. A key strength of the Global Compact for Migration is its capacity to foster collaboration between states, providing common ground for dialogue and exchange. Many countries have harnessed this as an opportunity to share good practices and learn from one another, particularly on complex and sensitive migration issues. For example, the UN Network on Migration's Working Group on Alternatives to Detention has used the Compact as a tool to engage member states in highly successful peer learning events on alternatives to immigration detention, in which Australia has been an active participant. The working group, co-led by UNICEF, UNHCR, and the International Detention Coalition, encouraged pledging on working to end immigration detention at both the International Migration Review Forum in 2022, the first global review of the Compact, and the 2023 Global Refugee Forum to review implementation of the complementary Global Compact on Refugees. At the latter, Australia pledged to continue to share practice and policy lessons from Australia's experience moving away from immigration detention of children, especially within the Asia-Pacific. This pledge was linked to a broader multi-stakeholder pledge on alternatives to immigration detention and ending immigration detention of asylum-seeking, refugee, stateless, and migrant children and their families. Finally, states and stakeholders alike are investing in efforts to counter dehumanising and hate-filled narratives being used in many national contexts to blame migrants and migration for wider societal challenges. This year, GCM champion countries came together to discuss the challenges of deconstructing and reconstructing migration narratives to counter xenophobia, racism, and discrimination. They stressed, among other things, the role of the media in shaping public perceptions, as well as the need for data to build balanced, informed, and evidence-based narratives. Last year, the Office for the High Commissioner for Human Rights brought its Stand Up for Migrants initiative to Australia, which aims to build human rights-based migration narratives. It launched the My Great Story campaign at an event encouraging early career journalists and students to rethink how migration is spoken about in the media. We're also seeing collaborative efforts to strengthen migration data collection and disaggregation, which is critical for evidence-based policymaking and reaching those often excluded from official statistics, including the most vulnerable migrants, as I'm sure we'll hear about in the following session. At the global level, the International Data Alliance for Children on the Move is one such initiative, generating better data on the needs of migrants and displaced children, with a cross-sectoral membership that includes 25 states, UN agencies, and numerous institutions, including the Australian National University. So in finishing, I'd just say that while we may see some momentum towards rights-based approaches in migration governance in some migration contexts, there is no doubt an urgent need for increased collaboration and responsibility sharing between states to curb the worrying trends that I touched on at the outset and the emerging challenges that we'll hear about this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rasika. So we have about 5 minutes if anybody has questions to pose to the panel. While we're waiting for questions, as I was listening to the presentations, I was thinking about my own trajectory, working firstly from a human rights perspective and then making a decision to move into the humanitarian sector, essentially because of the difference between what is aspirational when it comes to migration governance and what is a very clear bottom line need. So as I was listening to your presentations, I was thinking about whether, in light of the discourses that Rasika and Martin Phillips, discussed, and the promising potential that Ryan presented in his presentation in terms of the Pacific, whether you see a way around the, let's say, toxic discourses around migration being in alternative pathways, that instead of, for example, a parallel to continuing to promote human rights approaches and humanitarian approaches, we need to really be thinking about what are practical ways to address these problems that might be more politically palatable. Thoughts?
I mean, I think it's, okay, right now, at least in a country like the United States, there are some people who believe there should be no borders. Everybody should come. There are other people who believe there should be no migrants. And instead of them coming together, the no borders people have gotten more extreme, and the no migrants people have gotten more extreme. And so the two extremes are driving out the middle. And when you say open more regular pathways, which is the official, we are subsidizing the recruitment of Guatemalan guest workers. Instead of the employer paying transport, the US government pays transport. Instead of the employer recruiting, the US government, working with the Guatemalan Labor Ministry, has recruited. It's not working. Each migrant is costing us $20,000 in order for them to earn $7,000 while they're seasonally in the US. And the savings would be perhaps a little less than that. But, I mean, is that something that's going to work over time? You know, is it scalable? Is this sort of the initial investment? I don't know the answer to that. What some people, you know, so we're trying a whole lot of, I think many countries, I mean, the European countries are trying, you know, migration development, skills partnerships, you know, all of these things. There's another meeting tomorrow about looking at just the seasonal agricultural workers. And you know, I'm a great believer in what Ryan said. Individuals benefit by moving from lower wage to higher wage countries. I'm less convinced about the benefits to sending countries. The United States started recruiting Jamaican workers in 1942. 1942, right? We still bring in 10,000 Jamaican seasonal workers a year. 3 out of 4 people trained as nurses in Jamaica have left. And what are we, 80 years later? I mean, individuals and their families have clearly benefited. What's less clear is whether it's, you know, they always say if the country's ready to develop, migration's going to help it develop. If the country's not ready to develop, migration's not going to help it develop. And I don't know how you deal with that. In the receiving country, the numbers are typically too small to have any measurable big impacts, but they're big enough. It's like crime. Most people don't commit a crime, but 1 or 2% of the people do, and it gets the headlines half the time. And so it's a small percentage of people who migrate. The individuals benefit, but it is easy, and I don't know what the answer is, to sort of get people, you know, it's like you're not going to be struck by lightning, yet a lot of people fear it, and we invest a lot in it and stuff. And so getting people to understand, you know, realities on the facts, it's certainly a worthwhile challenge.
Thank you. Rasika, closing thoughts?
Yeah, no, thanks for that. I couldn't agree with you more about that, but I think that's with a different hat on that I would say I think Australia should definitely look at countries like Sri Lanka and Philippines that have been doing the labour migration for 30 plus years as a deliberate strategy, and potentially you can learn a lot about the impacts on communities and families from those, but that's for another day. On this comment that you made, Sanushka, I would just say that I think definitely there's always a benefit speaking about the contribution of migrants and migration to all countries in terms of development and contributions to economies, et cetera, and putting that positive spin because it is the truth. But I think if you deduce it sort of down to just migrants at the individual level and always talking in that language, then you very much always will risk the fact that all migrants still hold their human rights as an individual rights holder, and that is always at risk once we start saying, you know, well, if you don't contribute, then then what's your value? So I think there's always that balance that we're always trying to walk, and I don't know how you resolve it, but I think you always have to keep both in the discourse. And just very quickly on the issue of the aspirational and bottom line need, I think a really great example that, and it would be great to go into more depth, but we don't have time, is the objective on alternatives to detention in the Global Compact is a terrific example of where that compromise language was reached because of that tension between aspirational and just needing to get in there and make a difference. And I think it's worked, personally. I really think it has, because I've seen through my own experience how it offered a hook to engage with member states on progressing. And it's very incremental, yes, and it goes quicker with some countries, it's slower with other countries, but it's given a language that you can basically use, as far this way as you can and as far this way as you need to. Yeah.
Thank you. And Ryan?
I don't really have too much to add to that. One thing that's jumped out at me just from observing this, and I guess when I used to teach it over in the US near Phillip, was that it's quite difficult from a policy implementation perspective. Most, if not all, humanitarian migrants are also economic migrants. And so doing this from a practical perspective is really, really difficult. And so if you're trying to come at it from, I was talking about it from a development angle, from a welfare angle, there's probably a lot more that we can do on the humanitarian front if we're trying to come up with a way to select people with potential, because there's an overlap there. We don't have good answers at the moment. It's not done particularly well. And there's been some nice studies done on the US to try and associate the drivers, and it's really a lot of both. And you do have people right now voting with their feet, because if you're an asylum seeker here and you get a protection visa, you get Medicare. Other visas don't give you Medicare. You get to work for whoever you want. Agency is important. People are at the center of these discussions, not necessarily their home countries or the receiving countries. It's about people, but that's all I was saying.
Well, thank you for humouring my attempt to create a dichotomy where none lies. And thank you very much for the panel. I'm going to hand back to Alan.
Well, thanks so much, everyone. I promise you'd be well caffeinated. We now have time for about a 10-minute break. So please come back in here on the hour. There's coffee in at least 2 rooms around the building. Have a look around the Shine Dome, built to have no columns, one big dome. See you in 10 minutes.